This is the Layers and Transparency lecture for the Art 159 Graphic Design Layout class. Within this lecture, we're going to be looking at specifically Photoshop and the way that we use layers and transparency to recreate an album cover of your choosing and exploring some of the tools that we have within the programs. So, layers are simultaneous, meaning they overlap components of an image or a sequence at the same time. And they're worked in many types of software programs, such as Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, and even music and video editing programs. But even within the real world, there's sort of examples that we can think of, So for example, the idea of an onion, right? This is this sort of layers that essentially sort of house the vegetable there, and obviously you can peel those back. And even this sort of broader idea of, say, maps, right, where we have these multiple different points of information that are being shared at the same time, all within the same space. So whether it's the sort of roads that are being traveled or the highways that are connecting the actual areas, or the typography that's actually calling out the specific regions, and then the sort of hierarchy that's being used to create that, while simultaneously showing the topography of the area at the same time. So there's multiple points of information that are being indicated within the same space. Same thing can be said for music. If you think about musical notation, this is another example of layering, where each instrument in a symphony each has its own voice, so to speak, and this sort of accumulation of all of these different sounds together, when they overlap, they add to one another and they create that full sound that we hear. So whether it be maps or musical notations, these are sort of parallel linear tracks where the crucial information is being described simultaneously within the space. Now, looking at the way we can use that within design, and specifically print, most printing techniques require that an image be split into different layers before it can be reproduced. So thinking about any sort of image that you've taken on your phone or with a camera, that is being created using rasterized artwork, right? And when we print those out, the way that we recreate that, if you're using a 4-color process like a printer that you would have at your house on a desktop, that's being used to overlap to recreate the image itself. So on the left-hand side here, we can see this example of an image that's being printed out on a standard inkjet printer. And these, on the right-hand side, if we zoom into that, we can see that the way that this image is being created is these overlapping layers of color that create the larger image that we see. So if we think about the subtractive color process, which is being used here to create this image, it's amazing that we can, recreate all of these different images and beautiful recreations due to the proximity and the size of just these 4 different colored dots that are being put next to each other within different proximities to recreate tonal elements and these 3-dimensional figures. So this is really the same sort of premise within layers and transparency, right? There's a transparency element to the inks, and layering multiple inks on top of each other creates darker parts of the image. Having less dots within the area, or no dots at all, will create a lighter part of the image. And that's, again, it's that subtractive process. You're subtracting from white and you are taking away the color, essentially. So another example of this is, say, screen printing, right? Where this is a little different. This is not using the subtractive color process, it's not using the 4-color process that we saw within your standard inkjet. These are actually different colors that are specifically mixed using the Pantone color system or some sort of spot color system to specifically recreate that color. And so we don't have these little dots of different colors. We get these true tones and these true values, which is very beautiful, a little bit more of an expensive process. And obviously each color that you're using has to have its own screen and its own ink that would be applied. So looking back at art history a little bit, thinking about how layers were being used. Even in the Cubism art movement that took place in the early 20th century, these sort of collages and layers of imagery that they were creating long before the use of computers, they were experimenting with this idea of layer and transparency. And here we can see an example of this by the artist Kurt Schwitters. And this was created in 1923. This is paint, paper, and found objects on cardboard. And the Cubist art movement really embraced this style of thinking of this abstract work of collage. It's not only about language of forms, but lines and colors, but it's also about the sort of prominence of the collaged elements themselves and their potential meanings, even their potential distractions, potential truths, this sort of elegant and potentially profound addition to any work of abstract art, where they're actually using different tickets and signed papers that they have, almost like they found them within the house and have created this artwork, so to speak. So within that, we get all these multiple different textures that we can see, and these different colors, and the areas that are more opaque than others within the space as well. This beautiful grid and hierarchy that we see. So we can also think about this within typographic layers, right? Oftentimes we experience multiple stories that unfold simultaneously. And in design, we can sort of replicate this in a way that we experience multiple focal points within a hierarchy. Sometimes that actually means overlapping parts of information, whether that be image or typography, to help create some sort of message that resonates with the viewer. So this is an example of the Women's Foundation 25th anniversary design brochure here. And this was created by the studio Design Ranch. And the Women's Foundation came to them. They needed this bold look to help them sort of target a younger demographic so that they had a more diverse audience for their 25th anniversary gala. And these were inspired by posters from women's suffrage movement. And they gave the campaign this really striking look to that, within the fluorescent inks that they're using and this impactful typography that's overlaying parts of other typography, like we can see over on the right-hand side, and portraits of, prominent individuals and that are dedicated to the change and how this is interacting with these multiple points of information all at the same time. Another way we can look at this is infographics and data visualization. So oftentimes we think about layering or comparing points of information within data at the same time. And this can be helpful, if we think about communicating these ideas. So this is an example of the coronavirus protection measure graph here. And by positioning these two graphs at the same starting point and layering them, you're really able to visualize the difference and compare these two sets of information in relation to one another. And they're overlapping and actually using opacity as well to be able to see through and create this sort of obvious difference between the two different areas that they're comparing. Publication design is another way of using layering of information and imagery to relate two points of information together and create further interest for the viewer. So again, we kind of saw this in the previous example, but we often see these in different magazines where a lot of times they'll overlap text with an image that are related to one another, right? To have some further impact to the viewer and create some stronger connection between those two elements. So when we start to layer imagery, we start to create texture, and even when we're developing typography and layering that and creating texture, we're able to explore these sort of connections and relationships between these different components and this sort of visual gestalt of color, whether it's in actual color or just grayscale, and imagery, texture, and typography of the actual designs as well. And Photoshop layers work the same way. Photoshop layers are essentially like sheets of stacked acetate, right, that you'd be able to see through. Think about like clear paper. You can see through these transparent areas of a layer to the layers below that. And you can move a layer to position the content on the layer, like sliding a sheet of acetate in a stack. You can also change the opacity of that layer to make it more transparent or less transparent. And we see a visual of this here, where we can see the way the different layers are being placed on top of each other in a specific order that allows you to see a particular image or multiple images at the same time. And we can manipulate, again, the opacity, how much we can see through that, and be able to explore the different options there. So looking at Photoshop, the sort of layers tab over here, we have a few different components. Over at the top within the area A here, we can see the layers panel menu. And then if we go down to B, we can see the type of filter that you might be specifically looking for. This would be something like if you had multiple layers within the space and you were searching for something specific. But this is something that you would definitely be using down here, which is the layer group here for number C, which is a group of different layers that are put together in a folder. And the actual layer here is D and E, for example, placed within that folder. And this would also be considered a layer as well outside of that folder. And then E, we have the special effects and the drop down for those special effects. And then you can see the special effects that would be listed to each one of these individual images. And then G is the actual layer thumbnail of each one of these that shows you a quick preview of that image within the space as well. So we can also create new layers and delete layers, and that is used down at the bottom of our layers tab there, or panel, where we see this little sheet of paper, which will create a new layer that will typically be the default checkerboard, which means there's nothing there. We can see through that layer. There's nothing placed on top of it. And then over here, we can also look at the sort of visibility and toggle on and off the visibility of these layers. You can see that each one of these layers has an eye next to it, which means that you can toggle on the visibility. It is visible right now. If you were to click on that eye, it will make it still there, but just invisible to the viewer, essentially. And within these different layers, we have different effects that you can utilize. So Photoshop provides a variety of different effects, things like shadows, glows, bevels. These change the appearance of a layer, and they can be toggled on and off within the layer effects that are linked to that specific layer. So for example, we have a vectorized logo layer here, and we can tell that there are effects applied to this, and within the drop down of these effects in letter B here, we can see each one of these effects that are listed. And you'll notice that each one of these effects also has an eyeball next to it to be able to toggle on and off that effect, and you can double click into those effects to edit them as well. To apply any sort of new effect, you'd come to the very bottom of your layers tab, or panel, and click on this FX, and that will drop down all the different effects that you can use, and as you add those in, you'll see them underneath the layer in the effects drop down. Another thing to utilize is layer masks. Sometimes you don't want to show the entire layer or the entire part of the image. And layer masks are a reversible way to hide a part of an image. So you're not necessarily erasing it, but you're not able to visually see that. So for example, if we look at the panel here for your layers, you'll notice that next to the effects, there's this rectangle with the circle. And if you click on that, it is going to create a new layer mask for that particular layer. So basically, we can see that we have two layers here. The bottom layer, they're both the same image. One is the original image, the other one is a blurred image. And we can see that within, if we are selected on the top layer here, the blur layer, we click on the layer mask image, that we will get a new thumbnail that pops up to that is white, meaning you can see the entire part of that image. And essentially the way that the layer mask works is black hides parts of the image and white reveals. So if the thumbnail is white, you can see the entire thing. As soon as you apply any sort of gray value or black, you're going to hide part of that image. So you can use a brush to do that, or you can use the paint bucket, depending on how you are trying to manipulate that. But here we can see where before the entire part of the blur image was visible, it was white. But if we put a black spot on that layer mask thumbnail, it will hide the center part of that blurred image, revealing the clear image behind it. So now we can see the result of this on the side where just the edges are blurred, but the actual butterfly itself is very clear, meaning we can see through the dark spot here in the blurred image to reveal the clear image behind it. And you can always go back with a white brush to reveal more of that image if you need to as well. And then you can delete that layer mask or toggle off the visibility of that layer mask, and your full image is still preserved without actually erasing that image. We also want to look at transparency here. So as a sort of social value, obviously transparency suggests this idea of clarity and directness. And within design, transparency is a little different. It's often used not for the purpose of clarity, but to create some sort of dense or layered imagery that's built upon these different veils of color and texture. So transparency becomes an active design element when we think about the value of that being between 0 and 100. So 100 would mean you could see the entire image, 0 meaning that it would be completely opaque. And here we can see some examples of this in the real world, right? Different rocks and jewels and crystals that we can see through, and they are sort of opaque. It might distort the image behind it, but we can still see different colors and textures. Same thing in different packaging to maybe reveal what is included inside that packaging and give some sort of preview to entice the buyer. Within design, we often refer to transparency and opacity within similar things. Essentially, opacity is measured by how much light is being passed through an object. And objects with lower opacity allow more light to pass through them. Therefore, they become more see-through. So the more solid an object is, the less light that can pass through it. This translates to a higher opacity. And we can use opacity in a lot of different ways within design. Whether it's blending color and image. So compared to just solid background colors here, we've taken this grayscale image and using this transparent color overlay that creates a softer feeling while adding a little bit of depth and tying it into the brand colors, allowing some of that to recede into the background of the landing page and making it a little easier for this text to sit on top of the space. You can also use layers and transparency to tell a story. This is a great use of transparency by the artist Stefan Sagmeister, where he's using this red transparent cover, which is referred to as a rubylith, to expose the image behind it. So when the cover is applied, it's this resting German Shepherd, and as soon as you remove the rubylith, you're able to see parts of this red image that were hidden by the rubylith previous to that. You can also use transparency to create depth. Here we can see they're kind of playing with this text and imagery on both of these examples to create this sense of space and depth within the different elements of typography and imagery here. And even to define a space, to potentially house more pieces of information and use proximity to directly compare the sort of positive and negative space of the different images. Here we can see that this transparency is being used to create different focal points, really drawing your eyes to the actual sail that's going on and some of the models and different points of information that they're creating. So we can control the opacity in Photoshop by manipulating the opacity in the layers panel. And we can also use blending options to explore within this project. So looking at your layers panel in Photoshop, we have the different layers here, and each one of these layers has a opacity percentage that you can apply to that. So 100% opacity would mean that it's completely solid, you can't see through it at all. 0% would mean that you can see through it completely, and each layer can be manipulated differently. Beyond that, you also have your fill or adjustment layer. This allows for fills of color as well as a list of adjustments that, within the layers that you can choose from. So within a specific layer that you have selected, you can click in the adjustment layer down here, which is the circle that's half colored in, and you can explore the different hue and saturation, vibrance, color balance, so on and so forth to manipulate that image further. This is a really important one for this project. This is the blending modes in Photoshop, and this offers different ways for a layer to blend or interact with the layers below it. So without blend modes, the only way to blend layers is by lowering the opacity of that to be able to see through it, which doesn't produce necessarily most interesting results. So, but next to the opacity here, you'll notice this drop down that the default says normal for every single layer that you have selected. If you click on that blend mode option that says normal in the layers panel, you can see a list of these different blend modes. And if you are new to blend modes, it may seem like there's a lot of options and no rhyme or reason, but if you look at it closely, you'll actually see that the blend modes are actually divided into different groups. So when you click on that drop down, it's going to show you this here. And essentially, you'll have normal, which is going to show that as a normal image. And then you'll have all these different blending options. And there is some sort of rhyme and reason to this. They're broken up into these different groups of darkening modes, lightening modes, heavy contrast, comparative, and then composite modes. So I would explore all of these. You can really hover over these or click on them to examine how that layer is going to be manipulated differently within that space. And it's hard to predict these a lot of times depending on the images that you're using. So it's best just to kind of explore your different options before settling on the one that you think is working best. Lastly, the object selection tool. This is a way that you can select parts of an object and highlight that object to create an instant selection within Photoshop. So over on the left-hand side of your toolbar in Photoshop, you'll see this object selection tool. And if you don't see it, you can always go down to the three dots at the bottom of the toolbar and look for this. And if you look and you click and drop on that, or actually it could also be hidden behind either one of these tools. Anytime you see this, it'll drop down. You know that there's additional drop down tools there. So look for any of these within your toolbars. But the object selection tool here, this square with the mouse in it, allows you to just click into a part of an image, click and drag to get a general sort of selection of what you're trying to obtain. And you can add more objects to that same selection by holding the Shift key, or you can subtract by holding the Alt or Option key. And essentially this acts like a brush that allows you to paint over, and you can go through these different options to create the different selection there. And there's actually an additional video on this within the tutorial that I encourage you to check out. Beyond that, there's also the quick selection tool. This is a little different. It allows you to sort of paint like a paintbrush to get different parts of a selection. And that looks like this here. It's found within the same set of tools, but it's going to be your quick selection tool. And essentially it acts like a brush that you can add or minus parts of your selection as well. And then once you have a general selection, you can go into the select and mask feature that's found under the select tab on the toolbar to refine your selection. So once you have a general selection, if you click on that, it'll be up in this area here. It's again the select and mask button. It will open up this additional area where you can smooth your selection, feather it, contrast, so on and so forth. So once you have that general selection, go through that refinement to try to get that as clean as possible. And with those different tools, your assignment for this project is going to be to design a vinyl album sticker and sleeve cover, and you can choose what band or musician you want to use for this. I would encourage, or I want you to choose an existing band or musician and a specific album of theirs for this project so that you can have the name of the artist as well as the name of that album, unless it's self-titled. And you're going to utilize the elements of color, shape, line, and the principles that we've discussed here to finalize that. So you're going to start by analyzing three different factors that compose the album cover. So color, typography, and imagery. And I want you to create a style guide on an 11 by 17 inch tabloid sized document using Photoshop. You're going to research and collect 5 keywords that describe the album and what you're trying to represent. You're also going to collect 5 images, 5 textures, and 5 typefaces that you will choose for your album cover. You're not going to use all of these, but within the selection that you have made, you're going to pick different options within these different categories and start to blend them together utilizing some of these things we've discussed. So consider some of these questions as you're getting into this project. Who is the band that you are representing? What style of music do they create? What type of typography will help to communicate that feel? What colors will help to communicate this? What other sort of imagery can you add to express these ideas? And then how can you create a sense of visual rhythm that will express the mood and feeling of the music as well? So this is an example of the style guide here, or the mood board, I guess, where you have these different 5 images that have been collected, down below. and then the 5 keywords showing the 5 different forms of typography that they have chosen, and then the 5 textures above. And through the collection of these images, they went through and selected the ones they liked the best to create the actual album cover here. And you can see that they've blended many different parts of images and textures together using opacity and layers and transparency. And then you're also going to create the sticker here as well for the album. I do not want it to be the same exact image, but it can be pulled from the same images and textures, just manipulated differently to follow that theme. So you will be using the template that's provided for you to create these so that they can be used with this digital mockup that you see here as well. Once you have finalized your design, you'll apply that to this digital mockup in Photoshop, and that is in the video tutorial for you to walk you through the steps of doing so. So this is just another example here where the student put their keywords at the top, the images that they're using, the textures that they were using, and the typefaces that they were exploring. And this was their final result for that as well. That is using the same digital mockup here that you are going to be using. So that is the end of the Layers and Transparency lecture. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your work.